Hey everybody, welcome to another entry in the Hyrule Compendium. And today we're talking about the most underrated dungeons in the Zelda series.
Yeah, over at the website we've got a huge feature for the month of June where we are counting down the greatest 50 dungeons in the Legend of Zelda series. And it's going to be coming out over the course of the whole month. But these are a few dungeons that didn't quite make our top 50 list.
Yes. And so we were looking at the breakdown of the games on the list, and it's going to be pretty good because most games are going to be represented. But there's one thing I noticed that I thought was a glaring oversight, which is there are no Oracle's dungeons on this. None from Ages or Seasons. Which for me is a shame because when I think about what are my favorite dungeons in terms of like design and exploring dungeons in Zelda games, these are kind of like some of the pinnacle game like dungeons for me.
I would agree.
Like the whole, I think Link's Awakening kind of established this sort of formula, and then these games kind of really expanded upon it.
Yeah, for sure.
So it kind of bummed me out. I didn't put as many just because there were some from like the bigger games like Ocarina of Time. They're kind of unforgettable for me, but you know, yeah, I did put some, and I was saddened that none actually got up there. You know,
I think we would both agree that if we made our own top 50 lists, there'd be some Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons for sure.
I would, yeah, there would definitely be a lot more.
But
of that.
The feature is a collective amongst all 30 plus team members of Zelda Dungeon that contributed.
So this is I think these are the perfect underrated dungeons because, you know, I can understand why the NES games are maybe a little underrepresented. You know, it's kind of an older style, not a lot of people saying, or maybe, you know, the DS games, some people don't get into that style of gameplay, but to me, this is Zelda. These are like Zelda dungeons, you know?
Yeah.
So I want to talk about Seasons first because we did it a couple of months ago for our definitive ranking, and I think more so than you ranked the dungeons a lot higher, and it was I really like the dungeons in the game. Again, it's kind of the same concept I was saying that like Link's Awakening has, where you have kind of these different routes you can go on a lot of them, and they get more complex.
Yes, they definitely do.
Yeah,
for sure.
And I think it is pretty incremental, and it's really well designed. I think that it's like each one is a step up in terms of complexity, but it has that where you have these different paths, and it's sort of like I've heard it once described as like picking at a knot.
Okay.
Where it's like, okay, I've gotten this. Now that means I can go to like these places, and you kind of have to like memorize where everything is in your head, you know.
Right.
And it sort of requires some, you know, actual like pulling out the map and looking like, okay, where haven't I gone, you know?
Yeah.
In general, I think that's what makes for a good classic Zelda dungeon. So these have that, but then also they come after like Ocarina of Time, where they introduce some more like even more theming and stuff like that into the game, so you start to see that seep into these a little bit here. So one I like a lot is like Explorer's Crypt.
Okay.
Because you have the
two Poes.
You have the Poes, which is clearly based on the Poe sisters in Ocarina of Time, but I really like them here. They gave them some dialogue, unique like mini boss fights that they change, and then they have one where they work together. So I think the theming is really strong in this one because it does feel like you're going through this kind of haunted area in this like 2D game. Yeah. And also by that point, another thing that's a real standout for me is like it's one of the later dungeons. And one thing the game does really well that I scored really high on is it does a good job of mixing all the items together. So by the time you get there, you get the cape or whatever. I think you get
Rock's
the cape in that
cape
dungeon.
Is the dungeon item from Explorer's Crypt, I believe.
And you're combining it with like the Pegasus seeds, and you're jumping and flying around. It's really good and satisfying, and the progression of the items really plays a large factor in this one here.
Yeah.
And then there's
Ancient Ruins is the one before, the 6th dungeon, where you fight Manhandla. You get the magical boomerang. Yeah,
and that one, I love it. It feels, I said very Indiana Jones-esque, where you're kind of exploring. There's like, I remember there's like the Gibdos, there's like mummies in there, you know, like.
And there's rooms, you mentioned Indiana Jones, where like the walls are shrinking in on you, and you have to use the Pegasus seats to quickly run around the room. Yeah, I guess that's...
Yeah, exactly. That's totally that. So there's, I think there's ropes in there too, right?
Yes.
Why does it always have to be ropes? What's the quote?
Snakes. Why did it have to be snakes?
Very Indiana Jones-esque, but I think that solid block of dungeons really, to me, defines what I love about those games, because that also, you've gotten to a point where you have all the, like, a majority of the items you get in the game. It's got the strong themes, and again, it's some of the more complex ones. I don't like it as much as the Sword and Shield dungeon.
Sword and Shield is like it's a fire and ice like hybrid dungeon. That's kind of like a marathon of itself. It's a really long dungeon, but it has a few branching paths, but it's generally a straightforward pathway. I think there's no duds, really. They're all solid. But personally, I think some of the Oracle of Ages dungeons, I think, when I was compiling my own list, so each of the team members, we compiled our own top 20 that we threw into a machine to spit out the top 50. And I was debating by including 3 dungeons in Oracle of Ages.
Yeah.
I think I eventually narrowed it down to 2. But the last 3 dungeons, the Mermaids Cave, Jabu Jabu's Belly, and the Ancient Tomb, because they're all, I think, like Mermaid's Cave is a very unique dungeon.
I had that one on mine, and the reason was similar to how the other the seasons had kind of like, oh, what can we do from like Ocarina or whatever in 2D? This has the whole time travel element, but I actually think, unlike seasons where it's like similar but different, Mermaid's Cave makes full use of like actually the time travel changing the dungeon way better than any dungeon in Ocarina of Time did, and that's supposed to be like the mechanic of Ocarina of Time, right? But
Ocarina did that a little bit with the Spirit Temple. That's like the only one I can think of. But it's
the last one, and it's literally just you do part of the dungeon as a kid,
and
you come back as an adult.
Yeah, with Mermaid's Cave, you got to go there in the past, and there's like a puzzle where you have to bomb a wall in the past, and then when you return there in the present, that wall is now open, and you can go there. There's also a puzzle where you have to light a torch, which causes a wall to move, and then you come back in the present, and that wall has been moved, and you can progress. And there's a lot of there's extra keys in there. There's extra stuff. There's totally rooms you don't have to go to. It's totally like you can enter the you got to go past, present, past, but you can enter the present first and just get lost. You don't know where to go.
Right.
Like there's no sense of direction. But the idea of going into a dungeon, manipulating it, leaving it, going to a different era, re-entering the dungeon, seeing the changes happen. I think that's a very unique mechanic.
Yeah, it's good because you like are understanding what you're actually doing.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. It's not like you hit a button somewhere and something happens somewhere else. It's like very clear. Like, oh wow, I went to the past and like affected this dungeon. And you have to also remember like, okay, now I got to come back here,
right, and
do this. You know, it's just it's a satisfying feeling. Completely.
Yeah. And then when you move on to the last 2, Jabu Jabu's Belly and Ancient Tomb, really, I think are probably 2 of maybe the top 5 most complex dungeons in the entire Zelda series.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't like Jabu Jabu's Belly because of it.
Yeah, it's like a 2D version of the Water Temple from Ocarina of Time. I feel like because it's the same idea where there's raising and lowering of waters, and in a 2D world that totally changes the landscape of some of these rooms. That when the water is high, the place is fully flooded and you have to swim. Yeah. When it's at the level, like there's some plots of land, or if it's all the way low, then there's holes in the ground. Like right. It changes. Like the rooms become distinctive and platforms float or drop. But it's got that like confusing element where you need multiple keys at the end, but you can get them however they're scattered about the dungeon. I think you need 4 keys going towards the end portion of that, and you can do them in any order. They're kind of easy to miss, but it's like a whole maze, and you kind of get lost in it, especially because the landscape keeps changing depending on the water level. It's complex. Some people don't like it because it's too complex.
And some people, it's understandable, have a hard time with like the different levels in 2D. Like how does this room connect to this room, as opposed to
Right.
when you can actually look down and see it in 3D.
Yeah.
So I can understand that, but I think this is a great dungeon in terms of the navigation and everything.
Yeah. And then going forward with Ancient Tomb, the last dungeon in the game, that thing, there's only 2 floors, but they're like these massive, massive floors.
Mm-hmm.
And it's got the same where it's wide open. Like,
Yeah.
it reminds me almost like Death Mountain from Legend of Zelda, the last dungeon, where it's like you can go all over the place and you got to find the 4 tablets. The first few rooms are pretty straightforward, but then once the dungeon opens up, there's like 30 rooms you can go to.
Right.
And you got to get these 4, and it gives you no guidance of where to go.
Mm-hmm.
And you just explore. You literally fill out your map. You go to all the places you've been.
Yeah, you're
And-
like picking away at it again. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like up until that point, there was some of that on the like the Legend of Zelda, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that was something maybe a little bit in A Link to the Past, but that had gone away in recent games.
Yeah.
Like the N64 games didn't have that as much, I felt. And yeah, I think these are really standout dungeons. And I really think, there's like a perception of the handheld games a little bit. Like they're just second tier Zelda games, I think.
Yeah.
Which I understand.
We even saw it in some other games that we didn't talk about, but like, Minish Cap only got 1. Link's Awakening did all right.
Link's
considering-
Awakening seems to be like immune to this
It is,
because it's
yeah.
so old. I think that
Yeah.
there's like a nostalgia, plus now it's a Switch game as well, so it's like
I think it was an achievement for A Link Between Worlds to get 2, and
Yeah.
I think that's because it's like a newer one,
Yeah.
But then, these are kind of the middle of that time period where 3D was new, so people were probably not as excited.
Yeah.
We've already had 2 3D Zelda games at this point. This is kind of like a throwback.
So, like, when I think of some of these, the best of the best dungeons from for me, Oracle of Ages, like,
Yeah.
I think they're right up there with the best in the series. Like,
Yeah, same.
yeah, I know there's people with differing opinions. I know, like, Andy was saying, like, it's hard to, like, put even the best dungeons from some of these games up against, like, the mediocre or even lower end dungeons from, like, say, Skyward Sword or Ocarina of Time, where it's like I don't know if I agree. I think some of these.
I don't fully agree. I mean, I definitely had like multiple Ocarina of Time dungeons where I only had a couple of those, but then after we get past those to some of the middle of the pack, like I would say like a majority of the Oracle games dungeons I would put above like, Dodongo's Cavern or something, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
so it's
yeah.
It's weird. I just feel like some of the other games have higher highs for me, like Ocarina of Time, because 1, because of nostalgia, but 2, because there's still stuff to this day in that I'm like, wow,
Right.
like even just falling through the web of the Great Deku Tree still I think is so cool.
Yep.
But to me these are it's almost different where it's like those are like, look what we can do now in 3D. That's exciting. Whereas to me, this is like we have honed down the 2D Zelda formula and like distilled it, so perfectly. So
Right.
it's weird to compare them.
Yeah.
You don't know the list yet, so we're kicking off the list. But are there any dungeons you think are probably underrepresented in the series? I'm sure we're gonna get a lot of that.
Yeah. I mean, so we counted down the top 50. So just doing the math, there's like 100 dungeons that are not on this list.
Yeah.
And, there are even some heavy hitters from like, so minor spoilers. Not all the dungeons from Majora's Mask are on this list. Not all the dungeons from Ocarina of Time are on this list.
I think there are going to be some where people think they're overrepresented.
Yes.
At least I already feel that way a little bit, but well see, I guess.
Yeah.
What are the most overrated dungeons?
Overrated.
Should we do that one? Is that too negative?
I don't know.
All right, we'll think about that one, but
Yeah.
all right, leave us a comment. Let us know underrated, overrated, whatever you think. Like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe, and thanks for watching.